So hello and welcome to the Centre for Visual Culture's Royal College of Art Postgraduate Research Workshop. My name is Judith Meddick and I'm an Honorary Research Associate in the Department of Languages, Literatures and Cultures at Royal Holloway. I'm very pleased to introduce Teal Triggs, Professor of Graphic Design and Postgraduate Research Lead in the School of Communication at the Royal College of Art, who's going to moderate this session. I first met Teal many years ago at what was then called Ravensbourne College of Design and Communication, where I had come to discuss the idea of a cross-college programme of contextual studies, research methods, communication skills, and presenting your work. When this proved productive, I later worked with Teal in a similar vein at the London College of Communication and at Kingston University. Teal is an educator, design historian and writer. She is a foremost figure in the scholarship of graphic design history, especially in regard to feminist practices, independent publishing and design education, and also a co-founder of the Women's Design and Research Unit. She is originally from Texas, but she did her PhD a little way up the river from Egham at the University of Reading, where her subject was the graphic language of British punk and riot girl fanzines. Riot Girls was an underground feminist punk movement about girls actively engaging in cultural production. Teal has published extensively, and her recent work includes co-editing The Graphic Design Reader and Fanzines. She is also the author of an award-winning children's book, The School of Art. As a researcher, Teal leads interdisciplinary research teams internationally. Her most recent British Council-funded project is Building a Library for the Future, Munduruku Craft Practices and Indigenous Knowledge, working with colleagues at the RCA, partners of the University of Brasilia, and with Chief Cacique Domingos and his Munduruku village in the Para region of the Amazon.
Judith, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really pleased to be here this evening moderating this session. And I just wanted to say thanks so much to Judith for reaching out and getting in touch again after some time. But it's great that our paths are crossing again and that we're able to come together in this kind of way for what I see is, a group of the next generation of researchers and academics, as well as practitioners. I'd also like to thank James for allowing us to host this under the Center for Visual Cultures as well at Royal Holloway. We're very pleased to partner with you in this particular context. And just to say, this is the first of two events that we're going to be doing, and we'll talk a little bit about the second one at the end of the session. But again, thanks so much to everybody for joining today. And hopefully we can have a really good discussion around these subjects that I think we're all quite passionate about in the arts, design, humanities, communication, and the kind of broader academic community. I'd like to just maybe give a brief introduction and talk a little bit about how we're going to be operating today. Our first two presenters of four on the panel of PhD candidates, the first two presenters are exploring the form of writing. And Charlotte's exploring this through her practice-based research on a semic effect and the concept of uncausality. And Gareth, on the other hand, is looking at an exploration of translingual space in contemporary poetry. Our second two panelists, that pairing again, I think is nicely positioned. Yuan will critically question the conventional form of documentary through a fictional experimental practice, where he interrogates our understanding of multi-perspectival experiences. And then Anna will be kind of rounding things up for us, but bringing a much appreciated historical approach to looking at class literature and the visual arts. through the work of Charles Dickens, Rowing and the River Thames. And I think it's very appropriate today that we're going to be talking about water in some kind of capacity with the kinds of conditions that we have outside in London. So as you can see, a very rich opportunity, but a lot of links, I think, between the four presenters, much less to say that they're all PhD candidates at our institutions. So in terms of format, what we're going to be looking at is each panelist will have around 10 to 12 minutes to present their research. And I'd like to follow that with one or two questions from the audience. And I would suggest that if you don't want to speak, although if you do, please turn on your screen so that we can see you if it's possible. We do realize the internet connection is sometimes dodgy. But also please use the chat function and we can ask questions through that as well. So I'd like to get a little bit of a discussion going on around each of the individual presentations. Again, 1 to 2 questions so we can kind of maybe tease out some of the ideas or some of the things that are being discussed. And then at the end of the 4 presentations, we'll all come together again as a panel. And there may be some ideas or themes or aspects of the different kinds of PhD practices that we might be able to tease out a little bit and talk about more broadly. And again, picking up with any Q&A, any questions and answers that you would like to engage with in relationship to their subjects. And then we'll wrap up around 6:25, talk a little bit about the next session. But hopefully this gives us a little bit of time for each of the speakers to present, to have a couple of questions, and then to come together again as a community with further questions or comments you may have about the subjects that are being presented tonight. And just to say again, I'm very excited. I'm going to sit back and learn something from our colleagues presenting tonight. I think there's something really special and unique about this opportunity, and I hope everybody enjoys the next hour and a half or so. So with that, I think I'm going to kind of sit back and we're going to start with Charlotte and then Gareth and then Yuan and then Anna in that order. So Charlotte, if you'd like to kick us off, that'd be fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks so much for the introduction, Teal and Judith. I'm gonna share my screen. Do you see an orange thingy at the moment?
Yeah, we do indeed. Yep, that looks good. There we go.
Okay, now
There's
you should see my presentation, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So yeah. First of all, yeah, thanks for taking the time to listen to my presentation. My practice-based PhD is called Towards the Non-Causal Practice of Visual Communication. I submitted my PhD at the end of last year and waiting for my viva. Yeah, as Teal already said, I'm a PhD student at the RCA. So yeah, on this slide, you can see a composition of black lines on a white backdrop, and there's also a linear arrangement in rows. So this formal resemblance to conventional writing may automatically prompt an act of reading rather than looking at images, for example. But at the same time, an initial effort to retrieve meaning may be unsuccessful. So Mingle is a typeface that I created during my master in visual communication at the RCA prior to starting my PhD. And it presents an attempt to translate qualities of what is called asemic writing into a typeface. So asemic writing as an art practice, the term was coined in the 90s, and it's a non-semantic illegible form of writing that retains a formal and gestural resemblance to conventional writing. By definition, it seeks to dissociate itself from meaning. So A is a unit, A is not without away from, and seem is a unit of meaning. Yet when encountering a piece of asemic writing, this question of meaning appears almost unavoidable. And indeed, asemic writing and its sparse discourse appears unconditionally linked to persistent attempts to explain the asemic away. So in the last years, it gained attention by anthologies, web blogs, forums, online groups that show the variety of asemic writing, discuss its meaning, how to read it, how to understand it. In academia, though, there's very little discourse on it, and I became interested in exploring the value of asemic writing from the perspective of a visual communicator and type designer. So my interest in asemic writing is rooted in my practice. Throughout my BA and my MA, I explored the act of typing as creative and evocative. So in this interactive typeface, an increase in typing speed renders letter forms increasingly abstract, as in handwriting. While I was engaging in the practice of type design, I was never really interested in type design. And that was a realization that became ever more clear during my PhD. So rather, type design became really a framework through which I began to challenge and disrupt rather than service our habitual ways of acting and thinking. And this is another typeface developed during my master. So really my interest in asemic writing arises from an equal fascination, but also I would say frustration with the disciplinary confines and ideals of type design practice. And in the beginning of my PhD, I realized that this question about meaning in asemic writing is so pressing that it often distracted me from my actual interest, which is not how to make sense of it, so not to approach it semantically, but really to take it as an entry point to challenge habitual, causal, rational ways of thinking, which tend to dismiss or explain away rather than encounter the nonsensical. So what if I'd focus on other qualities of asemic writing that don't measure its value by its legibility or its ability to create semantic meaning? And what are these qualities of asemic writing? So if we return to the introductory example, my typeface mingle prompts an act of reading and simultaneously reveals an unsettling effect of an inability to make sense and to understand. And it further highlights the pleasure resulting from a relief of understanding when the text eventually reveals its legibility. By contrast, asemic writing deliberately fails to satisfy the communicative expectations it raises, so it really remains dwelling in this tension between prompting and also frustrating this habitual interaction with writing and also reading. And this tension is referred to as the asemic effect by Peter Schmenger. And it is this tension that actually became the starting point for my PhD. So focusing on this interactive tension in asemic writing, a key moment in my research was coming across Wendy Shun. She's a media theorist, and her notion of causal pleasure in the context of human-computer interaction. So she writes, my typing and clicking seem to have corresponding actions on the screen. And I began programming this very simple program. So Shun's notion of causal pleasure really refers to the pleasurable implications of a direct and anticipated reaction to one's action. The asemic effect, by contrast, translated in the context of human-computer interaction, describes a unexpected nonconformity and a moment of rupture between an action and its anticipated effect. So the term pleasure here is by no means arbitrary or unfounded, but is really fundamental to the way we interact with and navigate the world around us. So this relation between humans' ability to understand and to control and human emotion has been playing a key role in the development of user-friendly, human-centered computer interaction and also in programming. So if causal pleasure is a pleasure of a direct and anticipated reaction between one's action and the computer's reaction, I began to describe my interest in asemic writing through the concept of what I refer to as uncausal pleasure, which is a pleasure in which a deviation from an anticipated effect reveals new potential for action and thought beyond these repetitive patterns of habit and causality. And indeed, Chen gives to consideration that this direct causality between human actions and a change on the screen is a compensatory gesture. So these sensations of directness are really only simulated and programmed into the interface to trigger engagement and pleasure and to avoid frustration and confusion. So in Deleuzian terms, we might argue that the clear causality in human-computer interaction functions as an umbrella, as a mechanism to assert human power and agency, but at the same time, thought and action really remain within the protected, repetitive realm of the already known, closing off any possibility of change and discovery. So if causality supports human beings in their habitual ways of acting, thinking, and knowing, my concept of uncausality became both method and methodology to really explore alternative modes of thought, action, and knowledge, to make a slit in the umbrella, as Deleuze would say. I follow a transdisciplinary meta-methodology after Guattari and engage in this creation of the concept of uncausality. So concepts in the Deleuzian sense, they do not really seek to explain or define what something is, but they rather initiate processes of creation and investigation. So this creation of the concept of uncausality allows me to sort of detach this characteristic tension identified in asemic writing from its context and then seek common ground with other thinkers and other practitioners. The practice of coding or programming really became key in leading my investigation. So the language of code is imperative and declarative, and even a non-specialist might be able to get a sense of this obedient nature of coding. So set up, create, and draw are imperatives that the computer obeys, and the code written causes an action to happen, emphasizing the programmer's position of mastery and power and control, and therefore also the programmer's pleasure. So indeed, much of the early phase of learning to program is about becoming aware of this dynamic and to gain an understanding and test this causal relation between a change in code and the computer's interpretation of it. So starting with a very simple coding example and then alter the program by changing parameters in the code. Yeah, but actually these two things, writing the code and seeing the effect, is not that straightforward because the code and the program are disconnected. So there's always a switching back before changing the code and encountering the computer's interpretation of the code. And that again creates a space for dissonance and frustration. So here the computer screen displays two cursors instead of the familiar single cursor on the screen. So coming across the dissonance between what the programmer expects the computer to do and the actual reaction of the computer in programming is referred to as a bug. So it really creates a gap between human and machine. And the mouse cursor becomes what Deleuze refers to as an object of encounter that forces thought out of its patterns of experience and repetition, asking for a reevaluation of thought and also of action. And if the clear causality in programming affirms the programmer and their power, bugs sort of challenge humans' ability to make sense and to master, and they therefore address the most enduring human fear of being out of control. So the term debugging is really about describing a process of regaining control, of investigation, of closing the gap. And this usually happens by bringing the functioning of the computer closer to the human expectation of it, so reasserting human mastery. And a good coding practice usually involves strategies of preventing and resolving bugs. By contrast, my practice of coding in the context of my research deliberately seeks out and creates bugs, a bad coding practice, so to say, and I discovered bugs at moments of encounter that pushed me out of my comfortable position of control, of habit, urging me to reevaluate the known, to confront the chaos, and giving rise not to a pleasure of affirmation, but a pleasure of discovery, of challenge, of expanding on the already known. So a bug really is no longer a threat to human knowledge and mastery, but really an opportunity to reevaluate human action and thought. So slight variations in code do not just alter the program, but also change the interaction with and navigation of the program. And this iterative nature of the process of programming became for me an entry point really to create and encounter this mutation of the relation between cause and effect, action and reaction, between writing code and the computer's interpretation of it. So yeah, my practice is really challenging this prevailing rhetoric of connectivity in human-computer interaction, where an interactivity is simply a passive prescribed causation across the gap between human and computer in an attempt to smooth over the fundamental difference where nothing new can really develop. This rhetoric of connectivity is replaced by attention in between, where interaction is really not about assimilation of two entities, but about maintaining the entity's difference, where difference becomes an opportunity for discovery and creation, and the entities remain under tension. So this is sort of the space where my practice moves in. Here's the last example before I'm wrapping up. So on the left, you see Cunningham's choreography Beach Birds, and on the right, you see my programs. And Cunningham's choreography was created in collaboration with a software that would visualize 3D bodies that are not restricted by their anatomy or gravity, and therefore are able to suggest unexpected and unimagined motions to the dancer. And on the right, you see my programs that maintain a tension between guiding and being guided. So every mouse action is followed up by the computer suggesting a possible next step. So it's a junction. And at the same time, the next step is always a suggestion rather than an imposition. So there's always an active choice between following or diverging. And the action unfolds from this interaction with the computer. So my explorations, the video should be playing, yeah. My explorations result in around 200 individual programs, and they're not isolated interactive environments, but are arranged in these 2x2 grids. And every program holds a discoverable causal logic, and the programs may sometimes only slightly vary, but their difference is amplified in their coming together, creating this never-ending cycle of building up and shattering expectations and maintaining action and thought in an active tension. This research really arises out of the challenges and boundaries of the discipline of visual communication and type design in my own practice. It opened up to a wider discourse, seeking for spaces of reciprocal contagion between disciplines and theories. And asemic writing introduces a dynamic when thought and action is no longer defined by the already known, but by where thought and action confronts its limits. I think I'm just going to skip over the next 2 slides and call it an end because I'm aware of the time. And thank you very much for listening to my presentation.
Right. Thanks so much, Charlotte. Really, really interesting work. I'm going to open it up if people have questions or comments at this point. It's always difficult being the first person. People haven't warmed up yet. Judith, you got your hand up.
Yes, I wondered if your knowledge of German, which as I understand it is your mother tongue, if it has influenced your research, and if so, how it influenced your research, or perhaps not at all.
That's an interesting question. I actually was thinking about it just when you were asking me about, my mother tongue when we were chatting a little bit before this talk. And I don't think it, at least not that I'm aware of, it didn't really play an active role in this. But yeah, no, I don't think it did. But I feel like probably the fact that I I speak 3 different languages. I speak German, I speak French, I speak English, which so languages in general were always super interesting to me. I think that was one way one of the reasons which led me to my interest in typography as well, and really investigating this idea of language and this general fascination of how language works and how, we interact with language and in consequence with the world as well as humans. But not specifically my German background, I guess, but more my general fascination with language, I think. But yeah, I don't know.
Right. No, interesting question, Judith. Thank you. We've got someone with their hand up. Is it Kisalam?
Hi, my name is Kish. I'm at Royal Holloway. I'm a PhD student as well. Thank you so much for that talk. That was incredibly interesting. I suppose rather than a question, it's sort of a point that I want to make. I was blind for 3 years and my eyesight diminished over the course of that 3 years. And one thing that was really interesting was that type and handwriting changed form in my mind. So I would be reading text and E literally became an elephant and A literally became an apple in my mind. And I had some hallucinations called Charles Bonnet syndrome. And that stayed with me forever, even when my eyesight came back. But what I found was interesting was that after a while, people who are blind like me in my support group, once the eyesight had diminished and the text and handwriting stopped having a meaning, it just became aesthetic. It became a beautiful thing to look at, almost like art. So a friend of mine at Moorfields would look at different sizes of text in books and say that the margins looked like a frame to her and the text just looked like pictures. So not finding a meaning from the semantics, not finding a sign signifying meaning and hidden meaning aspect was still incredibly valuable for people who are blind. So I wanted to say that chimed with me looking at the visual images. It brought back something that I'm very familiar with, and best of luck with your research and also good luck with your defense, which I'm sure will happen soon.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. That's so interesting as well. I've never really heard about that. But yeah, I mean, it's this switching back and forth between, reading text and then as a typographer and type designer, it's not really about the meaning, it's more about the visual form of text. So yeah, that's definitely something I was always interested in. And it's funny to be combining these two things now in a written PhD thesis and then having my practice. So feels like I'm constantly navigating back and forth between these two spaces.
Sure, thank you.
Right. No, thanks so much for that question. Really interesting. Yeah, the role of the visual. Okay. I'm not going to get started here. Eleni has a question in the chat. Eleni, I don't know if you want to talk through it or if you want me to say what you've got there.
Oh, she's writing. Not able to put the camera and mic on, but I'd like to ask you to expand a little bit, if you can, on the human-machine interaction and relationship. What surprised you and informed your research? And this particular aspect that you went before you didn't. Oh, okay. Yeah, it's a good point because I feel like the most fascinating aspect for me about research in general is this idea that you start off with something and you think what you know what you're doing, so and then it could lead you somewhere completely else. So I think what I want to point towards is that, I came to this research from the perspective of a type designer, of a visual communicator. And throughout the process, it led me to, more of an interest in, the interactive nature, and also in this, an interest in this symbiotic relationship between the way we interact with the computer and how that relates to the way we interact with the world and the other way around. So, and I think what Eleni was pointing towards was this idea of considering the interactivity between human and computer more as a chance to push our perspective, to push our action, to push our knowledge beyond what we already know, rather than using the computer as a tool. So sort of offering an alternative perspective on how to approach human computer interaction in general. And I think that's by now where I see my research moving towards, even when I think about potentially doing a postdoc, or what could the next step be. I think this development is really crucial in my research, and I think that's a bit what I wanted to show in my presentation as well, that it's very, very much guided by a process.
Right. Thanks so much for that answer, Charlotte. And thanks, Eleni, for the question. I think
thanks,
asking someone what's, surprised them or informed the research before they do a Viva is a really good question that everybody should be aware of. Your examiners will ask you something like that at some point. So thanks, Eleni, for bringing that to our attention. Charlotte, I'm going to let you we won't interrogate you anymore at the moment, but we'll come back at the end if there's other things that we might want to raise. And we go on to Gareth.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can. Thank you very much.
Great. So thank you very much for having me. And I also want to thank Charlotte for such a fascinating presentation. And you've put me in the rather conflicted position of being very excited about sharing ideas and connecting my ideas to yours, but also having to follow such a class act. So, but we'll carry on. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Yep, it's up there.
Great. So, and again, to echo what Charlotte said about research in general, I think I also came to my project about translingual poetry, poetry in multiple languages, primarily from a sort of literary scholar perspective. And I found that as I went on, that the poets that I wanted to study, Christoph Tarkos here on the left and Caroline Bergvall on the right, they work across lots of different art forms and media. And so the question of the translingual became almost like a transmedial question as well. So I move across media now from the text to the visual, and hence how I joined the CVC research group. And hence why I'm here today. So I think what I want to start off with is that these poets, Christoph Tarkos, French poet, writing a lot in the 90s, sadly no longer with us, died in the early noughties at quite a young age, but was a poet, performance poet and visual artist. And Caroline Bergvall, also of French origin, but actually lives and works in London today, and is what you might call an exophonic poet. So she doesn't necessarily use her native language of French in her work, she's looking at a more translingual perspective. But what I'd like to say about them is that they're both of them ask what it means to speak a language and what it means to write in a language, and how when we say a language, there's always a kind of multiplicity happening behind that, that what we presume to be a singularity, both in terms of the language that they use, but also in terms of media. As I'm in just coming to my second year of my PhD, my research questions evolve on a daily, weekly basis. So to give you a snapshot of what I'm thinking about at the moment is how does translingual writing relate to transmedial creative practice in contemporary French poetry? And what concepts are useful for helping us to understand how contemporary poetic practice creates a space of contact across these different forms, across these different media? So we can use the term translingual, but something that I've also been thinking about is this idea of the postlingual, but it's an idea that's expanded on here by Yasser El-Hariri and Rebecca Wolkowitz in what they describe as a postlingual turn. And basically they say the postlingual turn forks between the right here and right now of the tongue, understood as both a physical spatial object and a temporal dimension. So what I think they mean to say is that in this, as we look to study literature in different languages and different forms, we're almost starting off from all language is foreign language to some extent. And I think that what poetry can do is help us to situate that that language and make it our own, which is what Caroline Bergvall says. And this is from a piece that she writes in Middle English called A Cat in the Throat. And that comes from a French expression, avoir chat dans la gorge. And she's talking about extralingual sounds, the intake of breath, the raspy sound as one clears one's throat, the spit that forms and wells up, the sounds that follow, the words that form. All of this is linguistically where you are and how you must begin to understand who you are in language. So really sort of bringing bodily mechanics and all the little ticks of language into poetry, and it's a poetry that's not just made of words and sentences, but perhaps using visual ways of conveying meaning and expanding what writing can do with this. So I just want to show you some extracts from one of Caroline Bergvall's works, which is called Drift. And Drift exists in several different forms, actually. It's a book, but it was also an installation and a performance piece. So it does tick all these transmedial boxes. And so Drift is a response to a case of a boat that there was a boat crossing over the Mediterranean in 2011 and resulted in a massive loss of life. And so I just need to compose myself for a second. So yeah, drift is well, it's a response to the refugee crisis in the Mediterranean, and in these kind of disintegration of language, and oh, sorry, I've just my connection's unstable. Can somebody still confirm that you can hear me?
We can still hear you, Gareth. Thank
Yeah,
you. Yeah.
thank you. So from here, we're getting to a kind of disintegration of the word, of the sentence, into what we see here on the right, with these just the letter T repeated over and over. It kind of simulates this sense of being lost, adrift, in a kind of fog of language, which is what we essentially the effect of what happened to the boat, which was it was cast adrift, and they were adrift for days without water, and this sort of sense of being adrift and not losing your bearings, essentially, is reflected here in the text, and in this on the bottom right, you see these sort of drawings, which are made up of the thorn letter, which relates to the old Norse sagas and Old English sagas that drift is based on. And again, we have this sort of clumping or clouding of letters, and how the meaning that's contained come together to form a sort of block image. So I would like to, just for time's sake, I'd like to move on to some of Christophe Tarkos's drawings as well, and these were on display last year in Marseille, and it was the first exhibition of his work, well, first ever exhibition of just purely of his own work. And with these drawings, you get a kind of a simple shape and then a caption underneath. But then the question is obviously whether is it a caption, or he calls them calligrams, which are a form of poem that was sort of, you may have seen the calligrams of Guillaume Apollinaire from 100 years ago, sort of visual poems that making a shape or form made up of letters. And but here we have a separation between the drawing and the written word again. And here I'd like to say that there's definitely this kind of a bit of a gap being created between what we're supposed to project onto the work, but also the caption as well. Just give me a second. A lot of the drawings are body parts, and it's a kind of anatomy of the self. There are some more examples here, such as navel and my smile, and a tilted head. But I think there's one body part that's notable by its absence, which is the tongue. And Ma Langue is the title of the of the collection of drawings. And of course, neither the words nor the drawings would exist without the fluidity of this langue, of the language, and the way the tongue can mold, shape, and play with the word. But in a sense, the poet's tongue is present in all of these poem drawings. And as befits the title, the calligrams exemplify my language. That is the language that the poet claims to be his own, but can't really fully possess. And I feel like this recalls what Jacques Derrida says in the monolingualism of the other. I only have one language, yet it is not mine. And similarly, Tarkos, he echoes that by saying, Il n'y a pas d'autre langue que la langue. There is no other language, but language. So, in a way, the language is one's idiomatic way of relating to the world. It's not a fixed idea of French. It's our own idiomatic way of relating to the world, and it promotes the sensation. Well, his poetry promotes the sensation of language and the feel of words in the mouth as the key element of poetry. I wonder if I have any more time to share any of the other drawings.
You've got about 2 more minutes, Gareth.
Okay, thank you. What I see, and then speaking to someone. So we're kind of confronted with a sort of thingness, things that are the senses are translated into a or concretized into an image here. So yeah, language is used here not to represent ideas, but the potential for language to act as an object in the world. And I think there really is in that title of Ma Langue. Tarkos, in effect, is seeing with his tongue and claiming possession over language because of its excess of meaning and not despite it. And I think he's sort of responding to when Derrida says, invent your own language if you can or want to understand my own language. In a way, he's inventing his own language by through the act of drawing. A couple more here. There's the one on the left is le, and the one on the right seems to employ what Charlotte was identifying before as async writing. So there's always this sort of limit where that drawing is sort of writing is coming up against and crossing over into drawing. So for Tarkos and Bergvall, the intervention that poetry brings, it starts from the body and the bodily mechanisms through which language escapes. And by inhabiting the in-between space between the senses, a kind of interval opens up, and where in this interval the reader or the viewer can participate more in the meaning making, I think, and that's what we get when we try and interpret these images. So I'd say that for both Tarkos and Bergvall, there's a sort of movement beyond lingual conception of language and towards a sort of translingual and transmedial approach. But that begins with the belief that the tongue always makes possible the new connections. Language as embodied by the tongue, but it's always reaching out to beyond its own capacities towards towards new forms of expression. So Thank you very much. I think I'll stop there.
That's great. Thanks so much, Gareth. Really fascinating. Two people I was not aware of, so I've learned something new tonight. But I can also see those connections back to some of Charlotte's, as you were pointing out as well. Questions for Gareth? Everybody's processing. Judith, I knew you were going to jump in. This is your territory.
I just wanted to say I really love this image of Caroline Bergval, is it Bergval? This idea of this the drift image and how it seemed to show this sort of, you could feel the kind of event essentially in the language. It seemed to me the boat drifting and the sinking and so on. It was just it was very evocative, I thought. And I don't know if you have anything to add. I mean, you see about it, but
sort of it definitely is a sort of evocative way of conveying that sense of losing your bearings, which is it certainly, I think anybody who's tried to make themselves understood in a different language will have encountered, and it's I suppose it's somewhat representative of that encounter with the unknown, and it raises the question of how to approach that question, especially in the context of that the journey, the dangerous journey that refugees will take across that stretch of water to a place that is ostensibly not open to them making that journey. So yeah, it definitely raises question as to how best to approach that and how to represent that encounter between languages and the sense of being lost.
Yeah. Charlotte, you've got your hand up. Thanks, Judith.
Thanks, Judith.
Thanks, Gareth. It was super interesting. Also to see, somebody coming from a different discipline, sort of approaching a similar idea. Just one thing that came to my mind was, this idea of translation, and I was wondering whether translation plays any role in your work, because especially I was just thinking when you were showing this work of Christoph Tarkos, because he was almost comparing or translating, right, the written part, or was the translation of what he was showing, sort of. And then also in Caroline Bergval, where you were saying that she was exploring this poem through different media, so this idea of transmedia and then translation. I was wondering whether you've thought about that in any way, or
it's a big question that I keep returning to about the relevance of translation as an act, as opposed to, I suppose, maybe adaptation or transformation, indeed, because something's happening to the in the word and the image. Is that an act of translation, or is it an act of interpretation? And of course, translation in itself, it always implies an act of interpretation to some extent. So I'm all for expanding the definition translation, and we do that. There are, intersemiotic translation is one way to describe taking a form from one medium to another. But I wonder if there's also something else happening here as well. It's not straightforward, intersemiotic translation or adaptation. There's a real sort of sense of leaning in what the writing process is carrying along with it, what the excess of that is, and the sort of playfulness, I think, of when you take things from one source and try to put them into another. What are the sort of byproducts of that are coming out of that too?
Yeah.
Right. I'm going to. Sorry, Charlotte. I'm conscious of time. We still have two people.
Of course.
Need to try to finish. Yeah, but I think this is the start of conversation. So please don't lose the questions that you do have. We can pick up these in one way or another. So Gareth, thanks so much for your presentation. It was really good, really enjoyable.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to shift gears slightly, but still looking at some of these ideas around perspectives. Yuan, you're next up.
Hi, hello. I enjoyed the Q&A session so much. Love the discussions on what translations and expression adaptations, and the last point, byproducts, is really inspiring. So I'm going to share my screens. Hello everyone, my name is Yuan. I hope you can hear me and you can see my keynote. I'm a 3D media practitioner and a researcher at School of Communication at RCA. My project-based research in the title of Transparency and Spatiality Beyond Place, Perceiving Events in 3D Environments. So instead of going through the whole project, today we are looking specifically at Project O, and I will provide further context for this. So this research project is built upon my 3D environmental practice. It is a combination of 3D virtual spaces and real-life environments. For example, I'm referring to screen-based video installations. It critically investigate the conventions of forms in documentary. So what we're looking at are some of my previous work. And in this research, I critically investigate the conventions of forms in documentary, including implicit authorial perspectives and linearity. The main research questions focus on how to document and interpret the political complexities and historical contingency of an event. A key proposition for this research project is 3D multi-perspectival experience. In my definition, is an unfinished operation of multiplicity of situated perspectives. At the moment, I'm still articulating this concept and how to define what the propositions and how to materialize these propositions. So it might sound a bit chaotic. So for this presentation, I would like to focus on Project O. It is a preliminary experiment built upon my theatric interpretation 3D environmental practice, as you see. So as part of the one of two experimental projects, this project was set out to examine the representations of situated knowledge and positioning through the lens of non-human agents. And this is a work in progress project. Please forgive me, my visuals are not as beautiful as what I intend them to be. Let's carry on. And so what I'm referring here is actually a very simple question, is who or what is looking at the event. So the project O depicts an abandoned house that caught on fire on the Ark Island in Ireland. The project contains 3 different viewpoints: a running greyhound, a wood plank, and a burnt plant. So I only today there is no render sequence. I'm still working on the scene and all the cinematography and videography, and how I'm going to reach to the point that to represent these agents' view is my following stage. So looking for a viewpoint assemblage, I have considered different approaches to assemble or to integrate the visuals and incept further viewpoints in physical environments and digital spaces. The directions I'm looking for in the next stage. So following my desk-based research, the project adopts visual materials of the site. There are some referencing. And it also pick up the concept and potential. It also pick up the concept that I investigate and developed in the perspectival shift diagram, specifically the later 2 parts. The intention of working with a fictional project instead of a non-fiction documentary project was to, at this stage, is to enable the materialization of various conceptual methods, ideations, without eliciting instinctual diversions, obscurities, or technical constraints, ethical constraints. I really want to go into some of the visuals, but in consideration of the time, I'm going to skip ahead. So instead of illuminating a very a promising path for my next stage, this project, even I'm still working on it, it raised many different questions, specifically on some concepts and definitions that I was not anticipated, or I have no idea if it comes up again after my desk-based research. But this is really interesting to reconsider some of the concept. For example, what is social representations within this fictional projects? If I'm talking about documentary, then why I'm using a fictional project instead of a non-fiction project? Events, sorry. And in terms of representations, in my traditional workflow, I work with, I reconstruct site with visual reference and 3D modelings and various aesthetic expressions. So how I can create a benchmark for the representation in my documentary practice. And in terms of interpretations, so to what degree it would be considered as interpretations instead of documents or documentations? And the last concept, directorships. So as one of the main methods that I want to interrogate the implicit authorial perspectives, what directorship means in the relations between audience, informations, and makers. So it raises many different questions and it leads to different directions. But at this stage, I believe is very helpful. And I'm really excited to talk to the audience here today about these concepts. So, So as a 3D media practitioner, I have been seeking visual methods and alternative forms of media to dissect, interpret, and reconstruct events in 3D spaces. Indeed, there are distinct differences between my previous aesthetic expressions and my practice and the documentary and the global documentary jargon we're familiar with today. However, I would argue these spatial expressions or reconstructions as documentary of social representations, they provide tangible representations to aspects of the world. They also give a sense of what we understand reality itself to have been, what is now, or of what it might be. And the reason I quote, the reason I'm borrowing or build upon my projects with Nicole's definitions is the later part of the sentence. It implies a sense of connection of temporality. I was testing out some ideas about temporality, nonlinear temporality in Project O, with different viewpoints and across different timestamps. But this would be a major part in my research projects in the future. So what Project O will lead to? It seems problematic at the moment. And how it responds to my research questions. So those are quite fundamental and meta questions. So what kinds of events this research project are looking at? And in terms of my practice, how my fictional practice at the moment is situated in terms of my research propositions and my research questions and the field of research. These are the questions that I just picked up again, because I think is working on a specific project. It raised further questions that I never consider in my desk-based research. They're quite different, and I don't have the answer yet. But Project does review something quite promising, and it does implies there are alternative way to depict or represent the event or documentations. So I will finish today's keynote in a very prospective lens. So my theoretical studies and the problematizations of events in my practice, I believe they will offer a critique on the current representations and production methods of documentary. And more importantly, it offers an alternative route that differentiates from current practice, such as forensic architectures and news games, in the discussion of representation in documentary. And that's quite important for me, I think. So I'm going to wrap up today's keynote at this point. I'd like to keep it short. And it is a very small scope to look at my research project, but I hope it sparks some conversations. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Yuan. Very clear in terms of what your intentions are, and raising some really interesting issues around stages of research and revisiting research questions and what that actually means in relationship to what you've already done, but what you're getting ready to do as well. So thanks. One or two questions in the time that we have. Could you maybe stop sharing screen so we can see everybody? And then Carolyn, you've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Yuan. I feel like there are so many possibilities with this project. Where it kind of links with my own work is my PhD focuses on deer and the poetics of deer. So I was really interested to hear about your choice of non-human agents and why you chose these particular agents. And I'm fascinated by the idea of having the perspective of wood and also what that kind of means for agency in documentary. So I know there's a few points I've made there, but yeah, particularly your choice of perspectives, maybe start from there.
Brilliant questions, and thank you. So first, I think the decisions about the agents is very similar. So it does is originate from my desk-based research on hyperobjects and posthumanism, and specifically the greyhound. I think is more a personal choice. It is in considerations of what I can achieve with motion captures in a way, and in terms of why greyhound other than other species, I think there's a fascination with greyhound in my life. And similar to the site, I think it's last year. I was looking at, or suddenly I just found various artworks featuring a greyhound. So it's very similar to the decisions why I picked the Ark Island. It's a very popular site. In terms of historical contingencies and whether it is a political site, it might not be, but there are a lot of attention to it in entertainment. So sometimes I make decisions that is less. It might not make sense in certain ways, but I think if it sparks attentions or is intriguing, then I think that's the first step of all the decisions I make in terms of my practice. And this is very different from my research project. Yeah, that's very research and theoretical research.
Right. Thanks so much for that question, Carolyn. I'm going to, if it's okay, we move on to Anna, because I know she's got a little bit of time constraint as well. So thanks, Yuan, so much for that and for the questions for that. Anna, screen is yours.
Great, thank you. Just get this up. Okay. So shifting gears quite a lot now, I think, and I'm going to take you to 19th century London. But just to introduce myself, I'm Anna. I'm a second year PhD student here at Royal Holloway. My thesis is on the representation of rowing in the long 19th century literary and visual arts. And it interweaves the disciplines of literature, visual culture, sporting and social history, but also tapping into studies on spatial theory, gender, and class. So today I'm presenting a part of the chapter that I'm currently working on. And I just want to preface it by saying that I was a little bit optimistic in my abstract of what I could cover in 10 minutes. So I have condensed it a little bit, and I will now just be focusing on showing how the 19th century perceptions of the urban Thames were built, with an indication to how this leads to a wider discussion on 19th century conceived notions of the countryside Thames. Okay, jumping straight in. The ecological state of the Thames in the mid-19th century was dire. And one of the factors contributing to this situation was, ironically, the attempt at sanitary reform in the city. In 1842, Edwin Chadwick condemned the city's methods of waste disposal, the cesspools, and instead urged the widespread use of the water closet, supposedly relocating the untreated household waste away from dwellings using sewers, with the aim of removing disease from the streets. But of course, instead of festering on the streets, the waste then accumulated in the Thames. And so the river itself became a mass sewer of human, industrial, and animal waste. And as Jonathan Ribner explains, by 1857, some 250 tons of fecal matter entered the Thames daily, leading to the Great Stink of 1858. So the state of the Thames is manifested in the widely popular gallows humour of Punch, where illustrations such as Father Thames introducing his offspring to the fair city of London and Silent Highwayman visualise the pervasive societal concerns pertaining to the state of the river. In the depiction on the left, a squalid, bloated rendition of Father Thames offers his three children, diphtheria, scrofula, and cholera, to the pristine figure representing the City of London. The Houses of Parliament can be seen in the background, along with the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral and the factory chimneys emitting smoke and gases into the air. The shaded smog of the sky mirrors the dark and deathly river, with dead animals floating to the surface, indicating the omnipresence of filth and pollution. Meanwhile, the presence of the Houses of Parliament directly links to the purpose of this parody being a design for a fresco in the new Houses of Parliament. This cartoon places the blame for the situation in the Thames on Parliament, and in their inefficiency to combat the stench, the image implies that they must be satisfied with their attempts to clean up the city. The dichotomy of the dirty river and supposedly clean streets is visually apparent in the darkened and inhuman creatures emerging from the river to face the white, pure, and supposedly clean personification of the city. While this cartoon visually identifies the state of the river, it also reveals the interpreted distinction between the space of the city and the space of the river, and is emblematic of the public opinion pertaining to the Thames. The skeletal children of the Thames in this cartoon mirror the skeletal rower in the Silent Highwayman, where the waste in the river and the association with death is apparent. This is particularly reminiscent of the opening scene from Dickens's Our Mutual Friend. Dickens's novel opens on the 19th century urban Thames. The narrative begins, "In these times of ours, though concerning the exact year there is no need to be precise, a boat of dirty and disreputable appearance with two figures in it floated on the Thames between Southwark Bridge, which is of iron, and London Bridge, which is of stone." The reader is directly drawn to a portion of the Thames just beyond the Pool of London. This area is synonymous with the working river due to the incoming and outgoing trade on tall-masted and steam vessels tended to by watermen and lightermen. This opening description is accompanied by Marcus Stone's original frontispiece, The Bird of Prey, which is on the screen now. And this visualizes the setting as our characters, Lizzie and Gaffer, are operating on the river, surrounded by steamships, rigged ships, skiffs, barges, and other elements of working river life. The dirty boat in Dickens's description indicates the grime and filth of the river, and this is furthered by Stone's inclusion of smoke rising in ominous columns from the shore. While Stone does not include the presence of waste in the river, the undertone is clear, as Dickens notes that the boat is allied to the bottom of the river rather than the surface, by reason of the slime and ooze with which it was covered, and its sodden state. While slime and ooze connote disgust and putrescence, it is the disreputable boat which introduces the aspects of disgrace and immorality. Dickens proceeds, "The girl rode, pulling a pair of sculls very easily." In the context of Victorian society, there are a couple of aspects of immorality and disreputability at play here. The first is the work our characters are undertaking. Lizzie and Gaffer are known as dredgers. They dredge the river and anything in it, including bodies, for money. This is not a societally respectable way to earn money. The second is the fact that Lizzie is a woman in a boat outside of the domestic sphere undertaking manual labour. She is the one who rows. Again, this was not an appropriate activity for 19th century women and immediately places Lizzie outside of respectable society. It is interesting that Stone decides to depict Lizzie in a moment where she is facing away from her father, implying a discomfort in or a disassociation from the work they are undertaking, and suggests the desire to move away from or up from the river, which I can perhaps go into further in the questions. Lizzie and Gaffer are of and synonymous with the river, and this river is the epitome of the metropolitan grime and filth. A few pages later, Dickens describes how a stagecoach follows the route of raw sewage, metaphorically follows the route of raw sewage to the river, as the wheels rolled on and rolled down by the monument and by the tower and by the docks, down by Ratcliffe and by Rotherhithe, down by where accumulated scum of humanity seemed to be washed from higher grounds, like so much moral sewage, and to be pausing until its own weight forced it over the bank and sunk it in the river. Here, Dickens delves further into the topography of London, as the reader follows the stagecoach's journey from the working middle class and clerical district of Monument down along the river to the slum banks of the Pool of London. Dickens not only depicts the displacement of filth from the city to the river, he also indicates the societal conflation of filth and the lower classes. Here, scum is both the layer of dirt on the surface of the water and also the people who operate on and beside the river. Michelle Allen confirms the synonymity of the river with the lower classes, as she explains, the people who lived in and suffered from an unsanitary environment, generally the poor, came to be identified with this environment. They did not merely live in waste, they were waste. So the image on the screen is an annotated map that I have created, tracking the key London locations in Our Mutual Friend. The direction of movement depicted in the stagecoach journey is mapped with a black line from Monument to the Tower, to London Docks, to the Radcliffe Highway, through the Thames Tunnel across the Rotherhithe. Tracking the movement in this way and visualising the journey indicates the clear eastward trajectory of the stagecoach, and that there is a duality in Dickens's linguistic use of down by. Dickens doesn't necessarily mean the trajectory of the journey to be down as in southwards or from a high point to a low point, but down as in downstream. The stagecoach is moving along the river towards the east end of London. The combination of this literary cartography, which is the rendering of a journey visual, with Dickens's use of language is powerful. Leon Litvak notes that it is self-evident that Dickens meant for his readers to be streetwise and to recall specific locations, occupations, and circumstances connected with the Thames for verisimilitude. Dickens expected his readers to know the topography of the London River and to understand what it meant for this stagecoach to pass through the docks and to end up in Rotherhithe. Dickens taps into his 19th century readership's perception of the Thames and feeds into it with the conflation of the dirty, immoral, lower class, urban river. So with the basic conceptual metaphor of moving down by, equating to moving lower in the echelons of society. At the centre of the social, theoretical, and geographical explorations of space, which are kind of posited by Foucault and Lefebvre and Bourdieu, to name a few, is the understanding that spaces have the curious property of being in relation with all other sites. So, for example, the existence of a heterotopia, to tap into Foucault, in this instance, arguably the urban Thames, allows for the existence of a utopia elsewhere, arguably the countryside Thames. And further theoretical explorations into society and space indicate that if we understand space socially, it becomes clearer that space is socially conceived and socially contingent. As such, I argue that the 19th century perception of the lower class Thames, or the lower class urban Thames, leads to the conception of the upper class upper Thames. Dickens describes the country Thames at Plashwater, Wheelmill Lock as tranquil and pretty on an evening in summertime. A soft air stirred the leaves of fresh green trees and passed like a smooth shadow over the river and like a smoother shadow over the yielding grass. Immediately, the description of this country river contrasts to the opening of the novel. This area is thought to be based on Hurley Lock, which is just outside of Henley-on-Thames, a town in Oxfordshire. And it is visually rendered by T. Ward in this painting, where Henley can be seen with pastel hues in the background, slightly off-centre, framed by an opening of the tree-lined bank with the river drawing the eye towards the town. The rich and varying tones of green offer a lush and welcoming feel, while the fact that the depiction of the riverbank consumes a large portion of the canvas suggests the expansive open space of this countryside. Meanwhile, the brushstrokes of the grass imitate a movement reminiscent of the breeze in Dickens's description. This pastoral image coincides both visually and temporally with Dickens's conception of the Thames at Henley, and it shows the towing path to be rugged and rural. This part of the Thames is idyllic, clean, peaceful, a stark contrast to the oppressive, dirty urban river. This dichotomy of city rural, dirty clean, feeds into the class perception and consequent conceived notions of the upper class, upper Thames. So in my wider chapter, I further evidence this through the analysis of the activity of rowing, and I delve into who is comfortable rowing on the urban Thames compared to who is comfortable rowing on the country Thames. And I go through and track and map and visualize the relocation of rowing clubs as they move away from the city. So they move westwards, upriver to Putney, and then out to Henley. And I show that this physical movement and relocation occurs alongside an amateur professional debate in the sport of rowing, which ultimately leads to the exclusion of any person who has rowed for money or any person who has undertaken manual labour. So there's almost a sense of class cleansing in the sport of rowing, and it kind of grounds it as kind of like an elite upper class activity in Victorian society. So these physical, social and sporting movements reinforce the ideals of the lower class, lower Thames, and the upper class, upper Thames. So just to wrap this all up, it's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour outlining the perception of the urban Thames, which is manifested in Our Mutual Friend, as well as the accompanying visual representations. And it shows the 19th century societal conflation of the lower classes, the urban river, immorality and filth, and how this leads the way to conceiving the upper class, upper Thames. Thank you.
Right, Anna, thanks so much. That was really fascinating. And questions around what it looks like today in relationship to what you're talking about as well.
Yeah.
I'm going to open it up to questions. We just have a couple of minutes, but time for a couple of questions for Anna. Everybody's thinking. Yuan.
I understand you don't have much time to present your research in terms of like the connection between the lower class and the upper class, especially in the case of like lower Thames and upper Thames. I'm just wondering, is it like a oppositions, or there is a different relations between these two? Is speculations, I guess, or deductions?
Yeah, I think ultimately what I'm arguing is that in the Victorian society, in the Victorian societal mind, they have this conception that the urban Thames is lower class, and that's where the lower classes are. And they have this conception that the cleaner Thames in the countryside, away from the city, that is the space for upper class activity. So there is this distinction in their minds of these spaces. And what I do go on to argue, and I talk about the river being fluid, and it allows for the transgression of boundaries. And in Our Mutual Friend, there's Lizzie Hexam, who I mentioned as the lower class character on the river. She actually progresses socially, so she moves up in social mobility. And so it's much more nuanced than this distinction which Victorian society had in their minds.
Really interesting. Thank you.
Right. Any other questions before we round up? No. Okay. Thanks, Anna, so much. And thanks, Yuan, for the question. I just wanted to wrap up by saying absolutely fascinating, 4 very rich subjects of research. And I wish we had a couple more hours really to kind of get into it. But these ideas around language and interpretation, narrative accounts and perspectives and the kinds of connections that were being made as well in each of your research. Absolutely fascinating. And thanks, Judith, for making sure that those pairings operated in the way that they did. That was very insightful. Just to say, again, thanks so much to the Center for hosting this today and for everybody attending. We do have another session coming up on the 1st of June, same time, and another set of 4 very capable researchers to again share in some of those new ideas and ways of thinking about each of our ways of presenting, ways of research, and what we're actually looking at more broadly. So Judith, thanks so much. James, thanks so much. And especially thanks to Gareth, to Yuan, to Carolyn, and to Anna. I think some really brilliant ways of thinking. I was also going to say that because we don't have the time to go into much more depth with each of your subjects, if people do want to connect, please either get in touch with Judith or myself, and we can connect you to the panel members if you have further questions. Because it feels like there's some things that people kind of want to delve into a little bit more deeply. And so I'm sure we can facilitate that in a way that's useful to everybody here. But if not, we're back again in June. And again, thanks to everybody, and have an absolutely brilliant and warm evening if you're in London. It's getting chilly out there. And thanks so much again for the Center for hosting us. And Judith, lovely to see you again. Great. Thanks so much, everybody.
Well done, everyone.
Yeah, well done.
Brilliant.